The first landing craft moved into range at about 6:30 a.m. Their ramps dropped, releasing groups of GIs from the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, not the Tommies that had been anticipated, who advanced toward dry land, confident that the Air Force had eliminated most of the resistance. In the invasion plans, the D-Day beaches had been carefully subdivided to aid the landings and the advance inland, and the area directly ahead and slightly left of WN-62 was designated Easy Red. Just beyond Severlow's primary field of fire to the right lay the Fox Green sector. Hine carried out his orders, which were to hold fire until the soldiers were knee-deep in the water and then begin shooting. The result was instant panic, driving the wounded and surviving men to take cover behind the beach obstacles intended to block and damage landing craft. Some ended up using the bodies of fallen comrades as protection as they washed ashore. Farther downslope, nearer the waterline, technical issues disabled an MG-34. Leaving Hine's weapon to inflict most of the casualties. Years after the war, Hine encountered another gunner from the 726th Regiment, Franz Glockel, who had been operating a pre-war, water-cooled Polish machine gun. Franz, only 18 and even younger than Hine, was removed from combat after a hand injury sustained a few hours into the fighting. The first American soldiers to land at low tide were roughly 450 meters away, with later waves arriving steadily closer as the tide rose, increasing their vulnerability to fire. Every lowered ramp exposed around 30 men at once, and a precise burst lasting only 3 seconds could effectively wipe out a platoon. At the weapon's high rate of fire, a single bullet striking its mark was often followed by 2 or 3 more. After the war, Hine later encountered an American soldier who had been hit 3 times while stepping off onto the beach, making it highly probable that he had been one of Hine's casualties. Omaha Beach view looking west from Severlow's position, with the Vierville draw visible at the far end of the beach. The pause between assault waves allowed the MG-42's barrel to cool slightly, but even so, it had to be. The pause between assault waves allowed the MG-42's barrel to cool briefly, but it still needed to be changed at regular intervals. When the gun was out of action, Hine resorted to his Mauser K98 rifle, which he later estimated he fired around 400 times that day. Targets were never scarce, as a strong west-to-east current pushed many small landing craft beyond their intended landing zones. As a result, even more boats ran aground within range of Hine's position. Lieutenant Firking and the rest of the crew were almost entirely engaged in spotting targets, calculating coordinates, and relaying information through the zigzag trenches so that the artillery battery at Houtville could carry out its fire missions. Severlow, fully focused on his own role, gradually realized over the course of the morning that his machine gun was the only one operating along that section of the beach. Years later, after consulting German military records, he found a message timestamped 10:12 a.m. reporting that only a single machine gun was active at WN-62, his. This discovery led him to reflect on his personal responsibility for the casualties inflicted on Easy Red. In his recollection of the fighting, Severlow described several waves of 10 to 15 landing craft approaching his stretch of shoreline, and estimated that 6 such waves arrived before noon, across the length of Omaha Beach. Each wave consisted of roughly 50 craft, including wooden-hulled LCVPs with armored ramps and LCAs, which offered heavier protection. Once it became apparent that the drop of each ramp would be met by approximately 50 machine gun rounds, many soldiers chose to jump over the sides prematurely, often into water too deep for their heavily burdened bodies. Machine guns are most effective when firing into dense groups, particularly in confined areas. After the men inside the landing craft were engaged in this manner, those who remained were then taken under rifle fire. One episode that would trouble Hine Severlow for decades occurred while he was using his rifle. Directly opposite the former position of WN-62 on today's beach stand 2 concrete blocks, originally part of a mill used to crush beach pebbles into material for bunker construction. An American survivor carrying a flamethrower attempted to take cover behind them, but Severlow killed him with a shot through the helmet. The intensely personal nature of this moment left a deeper impression on him than the mass of men cut down by his machine gun, and he revisited it repeatedly in his dreams long after the war. Shortly after 2 p.m., Hine observed several Sherman tanks farther west, near exit E-1 at St. Laurent, advancing toward his sector of the beach. By late morning, the main defenses of WN-65 guarding the St. Laurent exit had been neutralized, and American troops were already climbing the bluffs at multiple points. By this stage, Hein had expended his full allotment of 12,000 machine gun rounds and was forced to switch to less lethal tracer ammunition. This was a dangerous choice, as it risked revealing his position, particularly to American warships that were drawing closer to shore with the rising tide. Before long, a shell burst in front of his position, inflicting a painful wound to his face. By 3 p.m. Lieutenant Firking concluded that there was no option but to abandon WN-62. Many men of the 726th Regiment had already been wounded or had withdrawn up the slopes, and his observation post had just been damaged by shell fire. The moment had come for the remaining members of his detachment to withdraw through the communication trench, which provided a measure of immediate protection. Firking instructed Hein to go first and said that he would follow. Severloh later recalled this as an especially moving moment, as his officer addressed him using the familiar DU, something normally prohibited by military discipline. Hein ran down the trench as fast as possible, burdened with the overheated machine gun and an ammunition belt. The first edition of Hein Severloh's book, WN-62, was not published until 2000, with the initial English-language edition appearing in 2011. Until then, the primary understanding of the day's events had relied on numerous American eyewitness accounts, many of which remain widely available. By examining these sources, it is possible to gain a vivid sense of what it was like to face an MG-42, as well as to trace the slow advances off the beach that eventually left the strong point nearly encircled. At H-hours 6:30 a.m., LCVPs carrying soldiers from E and F companies of the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, reached the shore opposite the Colleyville exit. Captain Ed Wozensky, commanding Company E, reported that the moment his men stepped from their craft to wade ashore, they were met with devastating machine gun fire, collapsing into the blood-stained water until only a handful made it to the shingle bank. They were followed by several LCVPs transporting troops from the 116th Regiment of the 29th Infantry Division, who had been intended to land much farther west, but were driven eastward by strong currents and poor weather. For these soldiers, any planned landing tactics were quickly abandoned in favor of sheer survival. Within the opening hour, the headquarters company of the 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry landed to the left of Easy Red, immediately below Severloh's position, under sustained automatic weapons fire, and found men from the 1st Assault Waves trapped on the open beach. A reserve regiment from the 18th Infantry of the 1st Division was scheduled to come ashore before midday and sent forward an early reconnaissance element, but this group was compelled to revise its timetable after encountering the intensity of fire originating from WN-62. Hein was unaware at the time that one of his targets was a well-known figure. Robert Capa, among the most celebrated war photojournalists, had joined an LCVP, and his courageous attempt to record some of the invasion's most iconic images was almost ended by Private Severloh. At approximately 11 a.m., Ernest Hemingway, never inclined toward a peaceful existence, also neared Easy Red, but the boat's pilot diverted to another sector after recognizing the extreme danger of landing there. In addition to infantry units, the early assault waves included troops from the 5th Special Engineer Brigade, who later described exceptionally heavy fire between Colleyville and the next beach exit to the west at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, designated E-1. Severloh later supported these accounts, recalling that during a brief lull, he noticed a red flag planted in the sand below his position by a lone survivor to mark the area for approaching landing craft. At about the same moment, several duplex-drive Sherman tanks made it ashore, and one succeeded in silencing two 75mm guns on the far side of the Colleyville exit, allowing American forces to begin pushing up the bluffs. Directly beneath Severloh, however, no advance inland occurred, and by 8 a.m. conditions had worsened to the point that abandoning the Omaha assault was seriously contemplated. Naval observers offshore, scanning the shoreline through binoculars, could nonetheless see small groups of men beginning to climb the bluffs farther east, in the sectors of WN-61 and WN-60. Despite the severe difficulties at Omaha, it was evident that elements of the invasion plan were taking hold. Hein would only come to understand years later that his determined effort to deny movement off the beach may have influenced the outcome of the day. Although much of the destruction along this stretch of sand resulted from mortar and artillery fire directed from WN-62, Hine also played an indirect role by providing the suppressive fire that allowed his lieutenant and the rest of the team to function effectively and relay targeting information. What Hine and the others did not realize was that by as early as 1:15 p.m., Captain Joe Dawson and a group from G Company, 16th Infantry had already reached the outskirts of Colleyville, directly inland from WN-62 at the head of the draw. During the morning, Dawson had identified a route up the bluffs to the west, and together with earlier breakthroughs on the opposite side of the Colleyville draw, this meant that Furking's decision to pull back at 3 p.m. came just in time. In effect, their position was already encircled. Hine's escape from WN-62 followed the safest available route, through trenches, shell holes, and any terrain that allowed him to keep low. Eventually, he dropped into the sunken lane leading towards St. Laurent-sur-Mer and waited for the rest of his unit. Only one man arrived, Kurt Wernicke, the radio operator, who delivered the grim news that the others, including Furking, were dead. Within minutes, both men were struck by a burst of machine gun fire, suffering painful flesh wounds, but they managed to stagger on to WN-63, where a medic treated them. They recuperated for a while, but by midnight the whole group, including a wagon full of wounded and some American prisoners, one of whom coincidentally had German parents and spoke a familiar dialect, decided to move inland under cover of darkness. Shortly before dawn, they came under fire again, and it was clear that they were surrounded. Reluctantly and ironically, they asked their own prisoners to accept their surrender.